I had the thrill of meeting Jamie through a project that the Canada Council had undertaken a few years ago. I thought I would be afraid of him because of his towering reputation in this work. As it turns out, and as I confirmed for myself through those conversations at the Canada Council, Jamie is, he makes evaluation approachable. He helps us put it in terms that make sense to us in the very different kinds of work that we are doing. And he helps us acknowledge that evaluation is not always something that's externally imposed, but instead something that can be a part of an organizational resolve to learn what we can from the work that we're doing in order that we can do it better next time. So that for me has been tremendously exciting, and I'm so looking forward to hearing Jamie's presentation today. However, no further ado, I'd like to pass the talking stick to Lauren to run us through a few technical aspects for today.
Thanks, everybody. So I'll keep it brief. Please keep your video and audio muted throughout. We are recording the session, and we'll be able to share that with you after the fact. It'll be posted to the OC YouTube channel. You can use the chat to chat with each other, and also there will be a Q&A portion near the end. So if you've got any questions for Catherine, Jamie, or I throughout, type them in there, and we'll try to get to them at the end. You'll notice that we have English closed captioning from rev.com. So I've pasted in the chat some instructions to enable that. But briefly, just look at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and there will be a button that has 2 C's on it. Click that and show subtitles, and that should work for you. And again, we'll be circulating a recording and the resources from this session, including a copy of the PowerPoint via email in the coming weeks. So without any further ado, over to you, Jamie, to start presenting.
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thank you, Catherine. If you could just follow me around and just be my personal introducer. You did such a lovely job, and you're hired. It's delightful to be with you all today. My name is Jamie Gamble, as per the intro. I am joining you from the territory of the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq people, otherwise known to some as New Brunswick. And I'm in a wooded home office, wearing a dark gray sweater. I have glasses on, and I have gray-brown hair, probably more gray than I care to admit at this stage in my life, but so it goes. I want to chat about 3 things with you today. I want to introduce you just to some big concepts in evaluation. And then we're going to talk about evaluation for different situations. And in particular, as Catherine mentioned, a huge interest of mine is developmental evaluation. So we're going to talk about how do we evaluate when things are really innovative and really complex. And then I'm going to share with you a couple frameworks that might be useful for that sense-making practice that you may want to be engaging in around evaluation within your own organizations. But let's start at the beginning, which is really like, what is evaluation? And no doubt we could find multiple definitions, ways of thinking about this, but this is how I like to think about it, is it really begins with data, and data in response to a question that we might have. What evidence, what perspective can we gather to help us know more about that question? But ultimately, it doesn't end there. We need to make sense of that. We need to bring some kind of analysis to that data. What is that data telling us? What's its story? What are its implications? What are its consequences? And then render some kind of judgment, right? That we then say, okay, well, is that good? Is that bad? Right? What's actually going on here relative to our priorities, our values, our objectives? And then we do something about it. Right, that we take action. And in organizations, this could be a change in strategy. This could be the next stage of a project. It could be many, many different things. And so what I'd like to do to kick us off, and we can do a little bit of a chat jam here, is I'd like to ask you just to put in chat right now, what are, from your perspective, different purposes for evaluation? Why might we go through that process of collecting data, analyzing it, interpreting it, rendering judgment on it, and then taking action? let's just see. So great, Janet, compliance, right? To sort of meet accountability to go to for a grant that we have, or maybe for a grant that we are pursuing. Adaptation, excellent, right? The world around us changes. We need to adapt in response. Efficiency, they're coming so quick, I'm not going to keep up with everybody. To understand our success, so what kind of impact are we having, or what kind of performance are we having, to understand who we serve better, what is that audience experience. So wonderful, you get this, right? That there are many purposes for evaluation, and really you've hit a lot of them. A sample, and certainly in my practice, what I run into a lot are what's on the screen in front of you, and you identified this one, right? We try and make improvements. We try and do the things we do regularly with greater efficiency. We try and improve our performance, right? We try and increase the numbers, if you will. We try and do whatever performance means in our context at a higher level. The first one, right? We meet what is expected of us. There may be compliance requirements, there may be reporting requirements, things that say we are good stewards of our resources and we follow through on commitments. But a lot of you are getting at these middle two, which I think are really important, which is like they really help inform strategy decisions. Some organizations miss this, right? That the evaluation is externally driven, right? It is to meet the needs of others. But we are, and as one of you noted, in a very different world. We're trying to do strategy often in real time and changing to a lot of things that are in adaptation. And so using evaluation to shape that kind of strategy conversation, to tell our impact story, to say this is what we are capable of doing, this is the effect we have, this is the benefit and value we bring to the world. And so the next three are really, maybe a bit of a wrinkle for some, and I think more and more we're seeing this as part of the evaluation, but evaluation to actually inform, deliver processes around innovation, right? To adapt to a new context, to change, to respond, to do emergent strategy. We're often in this space of innovation. And sometimes innovation we stumble upon it, but more and more organizations are doing it purposefully. We know we need to do things differently. Can we accelerate that? Can we do that more thoughtfully? And use evaluation to actually support that process of innovation, which is distinct from maybe something that is just improving. We know what we're doing works, but we want to make tweaks to it, a version of that efficiency sometimes. And then lastly, a lot of evaluation now we're thinking about it in terms of empowering others. We do evaluation in relationship with other people, and we hold up their stories. We come to evaluation from their perspectives, and we do it in a way that is not evaluation done to people, but done with people. And sometimes that is the primary and only purpose of an evaluation, is to render other people's stories available to themselves and to others. So we're going to jumped ahead there. I'm curious though, I have Lauren and Catherine on the call, and this whole Festival of Learning comes out of the RU project. We were doing evaluation together. Can you just reflect, each of you, on RU and what you saw as the purposes for doing evaluation? Let's just give us a little bit of a case study.
For sure. So I'll kick off, and Lauren's got some thoughts she'd like to share as well. I think the easy one, and it lines up with a few of the comments that came in the chat. Trillium required us to do an evaluation, and remarkably, they were prepared to pay for it as part of the overall cost of the project. So at the start, it was totally about compliance. Lauren, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, and I mean, just more broadly within Orchestras Canada, we've been trying to commit to making better decisions, and specifically in our strategic plan for the next 3 years, we're going to strengthen our ability to deliver on that by strengthening our ability to do evaluation. So in order to inform our work with diverse perspectives, make decisions that respond to emerging needs, and are evidence-based, we've committed to strengthening evaluation in all parts. So I think part of the idea was obviously to evaluate this project, but also to learn from Jamie and the folks we were working with in general, to get better at evaluation and learn how to do it well.
And I think let me talk about why that showed up in our strategic plan. I think if you were to interview 25 people about what they thought Orchestras Canada should be doing, you'd probably come up with 25 really awesome ideas, some of which would take plenty of time, plenty of money. And, I want to be responsive to great ideas, but I also have to acknowledge that some ideas are likely going to hit right dead center in the middle of a target that we want to hit alongside our members. Some will be a little on the fringe. How do we actually justify doing some things and not others? And how can we take a sort of learning mindset to, take advantage of the opportunities that we've been granted through the pandemic? And evaluation just struck me, and getting better at it as a way of doing some controlled experiments, and then building that into how we proceed from this point forward. But always so many choices, only a little bit of time, only a little bit of money. What's the best way in which we can be spending that time? I hoped we could get some clues about that moving forward. And Lauren, anything else you'd like to throw in?
Yeah, for sure. We've just tried so many experiments throughout the past couple of years that were, necessary. And we don't want to not learn from what we're doing, and we don't want to not make better decisions based on that. So as you said, Catherine, evaluation is how we sort through, what worked well, what we need to evolve, and where we can get better at what we're doing.
And also, dare I say it, see if we can do a little bit of differentiation between a really great idea that was poorly executed and a subpar idea that may have been executed just fine, but still didn't quite hit the mark. So, always a little bit of disaggregation there in terms of quality of idea versus caliber of delivery.
Indeed.
That's wonderful. Super quick follow-up. You said compliance is your first one. Would you have done the evaluation work anyway, like even if it wasn't a requirement?
To be quite honest, I've had a lifelong ambivalence around evaluation. I've gone for periods of my life, many years, well prior to my time at Orchestras Canada, where I never had a performance appraisal. And I was just as stressed about the whole kind of feedback evaluation, particularly if it was externally imposed and I didn't feel like I was a participant. So there's always that sort of sense of, am I doing this for, me and the things that I value, or am I having it externally imposed and I've got no kind of negotiation skills? So when I looked at it and I saw that there was that opportunity, and Trillium was basically stepping up and saying, let's do it, I think I then reflected on who we could work with, who I thought could bring the same kind of positive, generative approach to evaluation rather than purely qualitative and kind of punitive in tone. So it was sort of this combination of several ideas colliding all at once. A person whose way of approaching it I was incredibly inspired by, and the opportunity to do it. So no, naturally, I think I probably just would have stayed in bed and had a nap instead of proceeding with evaluation. But granted the opportunity and explicitly asked to do it, I thought, how do we do it in a way that works best for us and sort of respects the kind of world that we're working in and our desire to get better?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and I through that, just because I think it's helpful to know, like, what do we want? Like sometimes we if it is externally sort of mandated as part of a granting relationship, as the common example, what is the negotiation, right? What is the, like, well, we will meet those needs, but what is helpful to us? And like Lauren, you really spoke to that innovation, man. Like, let's try a bunch of different stuff and let's discern, Catherine, whether it's like a good idea and or we're just implementing something well, but the idea needs to be strengthened, and that takes time, and that really takes doing stuff. Often we learn by doing, but being systematic and thoughtful and paying attention to what's happening as it happens. So thank you both for your response. Lauren, we set up a poll, and I wouldn't mind if we ran that now, just to get a flavor from the room. I'm going to ask everyone to identify up to 3 of your top purposes of why you might want to do an evaluation. Just give us a sense of who's here. And I'll just hand it over to Lauren to maybe add anything in there and to run us through the poll.
Sure. Yeah. Don't overthink it. Just what strikes you as the top 3, and we'll keep it open for about 20 more seconds and then share the results. Definitely a mix coming in here. All right, about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So it looks like the top 3 that have come in overall are strategy, improvement, and impact. So Jamie, any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm encouraged by that, right? Because I think if we had done this poll 5 years ago, I just wonder if the accountability expectation might have overridden. Like, I think we are seeing a shift where people are like sort of grabbing hold of evaluation, saying like we need strategy. We're in a very challenging moment in our history, and so how do we inform that? We are, I think the improvement in impact speak to mission, right? How are we delivering on our mission, and how do we do that better? So I think it's a very interesting result, and maybe a reflection of just the moment of time we're in. So thanks for running that. Let's move to part 2, which is, and we're kind of building a little bit towards
Jamie,
this already in our conversation.
There's just a black box on your screen. I think if you have the poll open, so you just exit out of that.
There we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yep, gone now. Thank you.
Okay. So this may be familiar to some and brand new to others, but I'm going to introduce 3 different situations: a simple situation, a complicated situation, and distinct from complicated, a complex one. And I'm going to give you a bit of an evaluation lens on these. A simple one is something that we know about ahead of time, and it's repeatable, it's predictable. So if we do something, we're going to get that same result over and over. Complicated is similar, other than it requires a higher degree of expertise and analysis. And a complex situation, because you've got so many interdependent features that are combining in unique ways, we can know about it, but often we can only make sense of it in retrospect. And if we repeated the same stuff over, it might not repeat in the same way. And so there's a sort of a great deal of unpredictability in those complex situations. And now we're going to look at a couple of videos to sort of test our thinking and maybe get a little more familiar with each of these concepts. So I'm going to show a very short video clip. As the clip's going, I'd just like everyone in chat to guess, is that a simple, complicated, or complex situation? And once we're a little more grounded in these concepts, then we're going to talk about what does all that mean for evaluation. So ready for video 1? Here we go.
Just 8 steps for at least 20 seconds. You guys ready? Step 1, palm to palm. Step 2, between your fingers. Step 3, back up your hands. Step 4, base of thumb. Step 5, back of fingers. Step 6, fingernails. Step 7, remember the wrist. Step 8, rinse and wipe it dry. 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 Rinse and rinse and rinse and rinse and rinse and wipe it dry.
So our first guess in there, Rosalind saying simple. What do others think? Let's just see if we can get a bunch of guesses in there. Is this a simple, complicated, or complex situation? So we've got 3 simples. Anybody think it's complicated or complex? I have 1 vote for complex. A simple and a complicated. Great. So others of you still may be thinking on this or just waiting for the discussion. Any situation is going to have elements of all 3 of these. So it might feel complex because there's 8 steps. That might make it feel complicated. But using the definitions at the outset, this is very much a simple situation. And for the most part, we could all go and wash our hands following these instructions. And for the most part, if we do the 8 steps as directed, we're all going to get clean hands, and We know that because these steps are well developed. They are a best practice, right? We use that word best practices a lot. And sometimes I think it's misapplied, right? It's like sort of anything that's promising or anything that we think is a good idea. But a best practice is actually something that's very, very standardized. And here we have something that is highly standardized. And if we follow the steps, we will get the same result time in and time out. So largely a simple situation. Let's look at the next video, and I'm going to get you to guess again.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs, candid is this one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going, too.
So if you haven't seen the movie, that's a clip from Apollo 13. And what's going on is the astronauts are in a situation where the oxygen tank has failed and they're trying to retrofit something using the supplies on the spacecraft to essentially allow the astronauts to breathe. If they can't solve this problem, they will not live, right? They will run out of oxygen. And so simple, complicated, complex, 2 complicated, 3 complicated, guesses coming in, actually complex, complicated, complex, could be both complicated and complex. So interesting that people are seeing a bit of a mix here. So it feels complex because the stakes are high, right? That if this is not solved, then the astronauts die. But it is largely a technical problem. There is a fixed set of parts. The parts can go together, in multiple ways. But if you put them together the same way twice, you're going to get the same result. And there probably is an optimum solution. So this is a very technical problem. It's an engineering problem. And so it requires a certain degree of expertise and knowledge. But if it were solved, we then have a model, right? To use sort of programming language, we have a model that works. And so if the exact same problem happened, 2 months later, we could apply the same solution and we would get the same result. And so it becomes a highly knowable problem. And so in this case, I think as many of you have guessed, it is a complicated problem. Last one.
Okay, this is where you want to get to, right?
That is the question.
Okay, so first we need to make sure that they understand what a question is. Okay, the nature of a request for information along with the response. Then we need to clarify the difference between a specific you and a collective you, because we don't want to know why Joe Alien is here. We want to know why they all landed. And purpose requires an understanding of intent. We need to find out, do they make conscious choices, or is their motivation so instinctive that they don't understand a why question at all? And biggest of all, we need to have enough vocabulary with them that we understand their answer.
I get it.
So again, a movie clip, the movie's Arrival. Amy Adams in this is playing the role of a linguist who is tasked with communicating with aliens who have landed on Earth in multiple locations in a big spaceship. And we've got 3 guesses, or 4 guesses, 5 guesses, lots of complex coming in. Yes, very much a complex situation, right? Because we are doing something that has never been done before. We are dealing relationships matter significantly in this. We are not only communicating, but we are forming a relationship with this alien species that has arrived on Earth. And the way that this gets figured out is very iterative, right? So in the movie, if you watched it, various things are tried, and then we learn something, and then we try something different is tried, and something is learned. It's very much a back and forth. But we're even trying to understand what the nature of the challenge is. And if successful, it doesn't necessarily mean it could be repeated, right? Those same steps may or may not work in the same way if, again, 2 months later, another spaceship arrives from another solar system, and following the steps like a recipe won't exactly play out in the same way. So this is very much in that innovation space, right? We are learning by doing, and we are trying things out. And so lots of lessons here for evaluation, right? Like the simple is all about having really good instructions, and then evaluation is about assessing, are we following the instructions or not? The complicated is very much about also kind of instructions, a recipe, but again, are we following the instructions? What are those instructions? And are we getting kind of the predicted outcome that we hope for? Where in the complex, we just have so much uncertainty and uniqueness in the situation that those kind of instructions only have limited expertise. So an analogy that's often used is parenting, right? What works with one child might not work with the next. And we really only learn by trying things out and really learning our way through that relationship. And so classic evaluation, though, was really set up around this idea that things can be perceivable, predictable. We monitor implementation for quality, and we're really kind of testing a model that looks like this, right? Many of you have probably seen logic models or been asked to do one, and it kind of lays out the logic. But we start to add in this idea of complex problems, and we think about, like, what are some of the complex problems we're trying to address today? Well, responding to a pandemic, we are dealing with social, economic, and racial justice in new ways, and those movements are at the forefront of change in many organizations and within our society. We are trying to address climate change, and so these are complex problems where we are really driving off the map, right? We're going into places that we have never been before. We need to learn our way through how to respond, what we do, what works and what doesn't work in that. And so that theory of change that I showed you before probably looks a lot more like this, right? It is a work in progress. We're making adaptations, we're prototyping alternatives, we're doing more of something, less of something, we're substituting something. And probably along the way, we actually get a crisper notion of what it is we're actually trying to accomplish, right? That we start with a vision of an end state, but that gets refined as part of our learning process as we go through doing something. And so we innovate, right? And Lauren was speaking on this in the last go around. Like, we try out novel things. We may reassemble stuff we know how to do in new and unique ways. We build on what we already know. But really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to experiment, right? We're trying to understand things differently, do stuff to learn about them so that we see what works. Very much what was happening in that Arrival movie. And so to bring this back to evaluation, right? Like, best practice, like a lot of what we do in the simple is we monitor. Are the rules being followed? Is the recipe being followed? Are we doing it to a certain quality standard? And that kind of evaluation tends to be quite effective. It tends to be quite efficient. It tends to be low cost in a lot of situations because you're just probably checking for a couple known indicators. But it gets really tricky because it's easy, because it's clear, because it's highly explainable. We tend to want to apply that best practice thinking to complicated and complex situations, which gets really problematic because they don't respond in the same way. Evaluators often talk about formative evaluations and summative evaluations. So formative evaluation is about improving something. We've got a fairly stable model and we're just trying to do it more efficiently or make some slight improvements in what otherwise is something that's quite stable. And a summative evaluation is saying, well, that works, right? That has, and the intended impact is this. And we know from trying it out, often in trying it out in different contexts, in different situations, it works repeatedly, and we can say with confidence that it works. Where in complex, when Catherine mentioned at the outset, we think through developmental evaluation. So the idea of developmental evaluation is really bringing what's best about evaluation, critical thinking, use of evidence, being structured and systematic, and looking at data and learning, but applying that to getting rapid feedback around what we're experimenting in. So we try stuff out, we pay attention to it, we learn from it, and then we make adjustments, and we do a next round of a prototype or an experiment. We're trying to more quickly move through that development process in something that is highly complex. Oh, sorry. Okay. You can't see this one yet. So I'm going to go back to our conversation with Catherine and Lauren, and just, what's on your mind as you sort of think about simple, complicated, and complex? What did you see in the RU project?
Okay, so there's a few things. I'm going to start by talking about simple. And, I think that there's a bit of a tendency, in my mind at least, to focus on the quantitative when we're talking about simple evaluation. How many groups applied to participate, how many were accepted, how many completed the project, how do they rank things out on a scale of 1 to 10. There's sort of a measurable and a predictable aspect of it. I suppose also even just the project management aspects of things. Did we roll this out adequately? Were people aware of the opportunity? And I'll also say that this even rolled into some of the projects, some of which involved what I would describe as the injection of technical expertise into organizations who had identified a need for that specific technical expertise. So, what are the best practices was the question. And, how might we get some of those best practices for ourselves? Classic example of that, I see Janet Sellery is on the call today, and Janet, of course, consulted with a couple of orchestras on health and safety protocols during the pandemic and how to return to safe rehearsal and performance. And, what seemed like a fairly straightforward, simple, request for what are the best practices turned into an intriguing, sort of went beyond simple, in that the regulations kept on changing throughout the entire period that Janet was working, and there was a lot of forward motion and then backtracking as conditions changed. So just sort of watching that unfold, I thought, I guess that's simple, but it got less, yes, simple but complicated. Janet has commented. Thank you for the emoji, Janet. Lauren, do you want to talk about complicated?
Sure, yeah. In terms of the projects and the applications, there was often quite a few different things that the orchestras were interested in working on. So part of the challenge was identifying something that could be well addressed within what was a 20-hour consulting engagement, essentially. And sometimes, the governance mixed in with the audience development, mixed in with the fundraising. So part of what we had to do was rely on some of the expertise we had engaged. We had engaged Lucy White, who's on the call, in a lead consultant kind of project management role. And she was wonderful for helping us to determine what could be worked on within the time allotted with the consultants and what the core issues were in order to make a good match. So she was doing kind of some Jenga between the consultants and what the orchestras had identified. And part of that, we got a lot of them right. Some of them we didn't get totally right, and that's part of what we're reflecting on in the evaluation. But it took that expertise to get there, and that expertise to know what worked and what we would need to improve going forward.
Lots of moving parts.
Yes.
And let me talk about complex, because one of the reasons why I'm passionate about symphony orchestra organizations is their complexity. There's a multitude of stakeholders, and they don't always agree on what as my dad, the Crown Attorney, used to say, what is the triable issue here? That definitions of success are quite varied across the organization. If you're a board member, if you're a musician, if you're an audience member, if you are in administration, just a whole series of things that, depending on which angle you're looking at it from, something might be very perceived as successful, and some things not so much. I'd also say that we were dealing with a couple of variables. We had these complex organizations that had identified needs. We also had consultants, some of whom we knew quite well and some of whom we didn't. And so there was a little bit of a test tube science project kind of, if we add, manganese something or other to this? Will it turn into a beautiful purple fluid, or will it catch on fire and burn down the basement? Just not being 100% sure that it was going to, that we could predict the results. And we add in projects that really identified from the outset as a collective request from the organization, and others that were perhaps a little bit more around an individual affiliated with the organization in an important role, saying, I need this counsel now. And so the more people you add to the project, I suggest that the more complex it can get. I also appreciate Anne Malochik's reference. She's got it right in terms of the chemistry set in the basement and what beautiful color the fluid turns when you add that particular thing. Anyway, just to digress and say, orchestras are inherently complex. We're at a really interesting inflection point with respects to what's next. And then we had the further sort of random factor of skilled consultants, but would the chemistry work, and was the expertise what was required?
Well, thank you both. Great. It really lands it in the orchestra world and in the experience of RU, like that the evaluation that we did on RU had simple, complicated, and complex elements. And your observations about organizations really speak to this idea of like patch evaluations. And there will be simple aspects of your work, like maybe the ticketing system and an assessment of that might be quite simple and highly structured. The classics of organizational life, like marketing and fundraising, are often technical challenges. We have really well developed ways of working in that, and those do become sort of more, in that more complicated range. And then things like you raised, like government and what is our role in our community now as things change, is very, very, very complex. And so noting those differences and then thinking about what approaches to evaluation are most suitable, and really what style of thinking is most suitable to those is really, really important. So I'm going to share my screen again and just continue with our presentation. And bring this back up. And what I want to share with you now is one last video, which is we're going to talk a little bit about how we land this in our organizations. This evaluation is not a black box. It's not a thing that we can separate from our work, ship it out, wait for the report, and then just magically all of these things will happen. The success I've seen with organizations is when they think about clear strategies for how we integrate the thinking and the change process from what we learn from evaluation into our organizations. So let's just start with a video here, which sets this up.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're gonna finish this.
Okay.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Toby.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map. You'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere and the bottom is given to the Southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
Because it's freaking me out. That's the line I want you to remember from this video. Because this is what often happens in our organizations when we are confronted by challenging data. Things that upset our assumptions around the way things used to be or the way they should be or where we want them to go. And we require, I think, as humans, a recognition that we have lots of biases, right? That we have things that will get in the way of us making good use of data and evidence. And this is just a small sample of confirmation bias, bounded awareness, sunk cost fallacy, the one around like just the information that's most proximate to us or more recent to us or more severe in our memory will stand out. And there are many, many more. And if you just Google cognitive biases or critical thinking biases, you'll get a long, long list. But the point I want to make is that can get in the way of us implementing change in our organizations really, really quickly. And as an evaluator, I see it time and time again. And what I really want to leave you with today is the message that building structured processes in your organizations for bringing the challenging perspective and data in a way that you can really confront it, wrestle with it in a meaningful way is helpful. And so there are many, many inquiry frameworks out there. These are not, you may have noticed we haven't talked about methods at all today. We haven't talked about surveys, we haven't talked about interviews, we haven't talked about polling, because there's so many different ways that we can get data and information that the big challenge is not getting more information. Certainly some data is harder to get than others, and sometimes there's a challenge of time and distance. But ultimately, the big challenge that I see in organizations, or where most organizations fall short, is they don't actually create time and space and processes to come together to look at the data and say, well, what does this mean for us? What's going on here, and what are we going to do about it? And so I'm going to introduce you really quickly, and then I'd like to hear from Catherine and Lauren again, just your reflections on the evaluation process we used in RU. That there are just some simple questions we can sometimes ask ourselves, right? Like who, what, where, when, why, and how, or what, so what, now what. So what is what just happened? So what is what is the significance of that? And now what are we going to do about it? The one most significant change is a structured process for asking a whole bunch of different stakeholders, different people who are involved. It's a very inductive way to get at impact, but it's a process for saying, what do you think the most significant change here is? And you'd be surprised what stands out for people as they come into something from different points in the system. But again, if we are really trying to engage people in different ways, thinking of different strategies and ways to get at perspective and information can really help us understand the larger picture, right? The larger system that we're operating in and what is going on. So that is just a very quick introduction to a sampling of inquiry frameworks. In the follow-up resources that you're going to get, there's going to be a link to betterevaluation.org, where you could find many, many different resources on methodologies, on practices, on inquiry frameworks. What I'd really like you to take away, though, is that what is our process? Where is the time and space? When and where does this happen in our organizations? And do we fall short on that? And what can we do to make sure that we bring in data, right, back to that first slide, interpret it, render judgment on it, and then make decisions together around what action is next. And so I know we're cutting into our Q&A time, and I want to make sure we get at that a little bit. Catherine and Lauren, any just quick thoughts on the RU evaluation process before we get to the Q&A?
I'm going to say two things and then toss the baton to Lauren. I think one of the things that I'm reflecting on is the amount of discussion time that we built into this particular process, that it wasn't simply a matter of looking at survey results. There were meetings with the consultants, there were conversations and feedback from participants, and there was a lot of structured time looking at that input in a really kind of graphic presentation to help us get sorted, and time to reflect together on what it meant. So those are just things I'm pondering. Lauren, what would you throw in?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was so valuable about this process was the number of different perspectives that were represented in evaluating and discussing through it. So we had, obviously, working with Jamie was amazing. So much I learned from that. We worked with a steering committee of folks who were involved in small budget and youth orchestras, and they had really great feedback on us, the project throughout. We had a roundtable with the consultants, and as Catherine said, making time specifically to debrief and kind of work through what had happened and then what could happen. So what, now what? It was really valuable for us and for me personally, just learning. Yes, Catherine.
Yeah, okay. There's a couple of things I'd like to throw in here about questions I had about the input that we got, and just sort of reflections on what might be different next time, if there's a next time. There's an acronym LGAB, L-G-A-B, look good, avoid blame, and thinking about the responses we had from participating orchestras and from the consultants, just sort of wondering how much was people saying everything was amazing, we hit all our marks, versus, you know, some of the dirtier details about what really went down. You know, we just sort of have to know that there is likely more complexity than what people are necessarily prepared to put in writing. Curious about whether working virtually, because this was, as you know, a Zoom powered project, in terms of the contact between consultants and participants, was that a net win or a net challenge? At OC, we're running a lot of projects at the same time. Did we give this all the time that we needed to? And also reflection on the extent to which the enforced timelines of the project either aided or got in the way of things being as successful as they could have been. So just some sort of things that I'm pondering, most of which have to do with design, some of which have to do with the times we be in.
Yeah, thanks. I think you were really clear on your questions, right? These are the design choices we're wrestling with now and possibly in the future. These are the bigger strategy questions at Orchestra Canada, and this is what we want to discern about the impact of this thing that we are doing. And those became a touchstone to come back to again and again, but not so carved in stone that you couldn't add new questions as you sort of moved your way through the project. And
sure,
I think that was quite important.
And something else that I want to reflect on is that I think there was an overall giant framing question that's one of my favorite ones to ask as someone who runs an arts service organization. What is going to feel like help? And, you know, there's both the content of what the help is, but there's also how it's going to feel. And did this feel like help? Were caring, concerned, smart people engaged, and were they given what they needed to feel as though they received the assistance that they signed on for? And that's both a very vague question, but I think also a pretty good one, because it meant that we could continue to evolve our ways of questioning to drive at whether or not it felt like help.
Fantastic. We're close on time. I'm going to see if we can multitask here. So Lauren, I know you've got a poll you want to run. You want some feedback on the potential of a future program, but also want to, in parallel, invite people to put into chat any questions they may have. They could be like clarifying questions. They could be, things that you want that I didn't touch on that you might want me to try and speak to in terms of evaluation. And so please do both to the best that your multitasking capacities will let you. Do the poll and also questions, and maybe I'll just do a batch response to whatever questions we have. I'll try and answer as many as we have at the end.
All right, so we've got the poll up on the screen, and as Jamie was saying, put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get those in the last 5 minutes or so.
I see that my rude comments about Zoom are getting some defense of Zoom in the chat. Folks, it's really just a question. Whether being in the same space with someone would have felt more like help, but understanding the times we're in, or whether Zoom is the bomb and we should consider that a tool in our quiver moving forward.
Okay, we've got a few responses to the poll. Close it off there. So 77% would absolutely participate. Thank you so much. We really hope that we're able to do something building on this idea in the future. And maybe Catherine can chat about that. But totally also understand the it depends question. It's something we've been talking about as well. Catherine, any thoughts there?
Sure. So I think that our interest, I was blown away by the responses from the participating orchestras in the written reports that you submitted. It took time from your organizations, it took energy from your organizations, and it appears that this particular strategic investment was well received by so many of you. We've got some learnings that we want to apply to a future iteration of the program. I'll be blunt and say, and you're all orchestra people, you'll know where I'm coming from. We need to find the money to be able to launch the program. One of my dreams is that we make it a regular offering so that you apply when you're ready, and we're not putting you through a, you do it now or forget about it forever, so that there's just an aspect that you can get the help that you need at the time when you need it, and we can work around your organizational schedules most effectively. But as I say, this is my dream. Part of it will depend. Sorry about the cat's tail. He's on the prowl right now. It must be lunchtime. But just to say, we believe that we've learned enough, and that we hope we can make a strong enough case to find fresh investors. So that's our initial thinking. Anything else I should address at this point?
Well, we didn't get any questions, Catherine, so I would maybe turn it to you and Lauren. If you have any questions, maybe one observation I would make, because I skipped over this a little bit when we did the inquiry frameworks, but think about who you involve is very, very important, right? So sometimes having just an internal perspective is helpful. Like sometimes having members of the community not just be part of your data source, but be part of that interpretation and judgment piece, right? To help them, and the more complex the problem, probably the more varied you want to have different perspectives in the room. Sometimes organizations have a lot of success around those processes, inviting in a peer, someone from another, in your case, another orchestra who might come in and not have enough context to know like the situation, but not be as married to the organization, right? And can sometimes provide critical feedback in a way that is helpful. So something to think about there. But I think we're pretty much at time, unless you want to squeeze one in, Catherine.
I think there's
Lauren.
one more thing I'm going to encourage Lauren to come forward with, and that was the conversation we had about real talk about real issues. Do you want to say a little bit about a learning that we believe we've taken away from the festival?
Yes, well, I'll point you first to the evaluation feedback survey. We've been doing those throughout, and one of the comments that came out from that was that it's been so helpful to hear the perspectives of orchestras who are working through this and kind of have the real life case studies. It's one thing to be theoretical, but having some knowledge from your peers. So that's informing just a lot of what we're doing at OC, trying to improve our peer group meetings in terms of how we engage experts versus peer expertise in our programming. So yeah, we're learning from this project for this project or future iterations of it, but also just generally we've learned so much for OC's programming. So thank you all so much for generously sharing your time and your perspectives with us. And please do it one more time in the feedback survey that's in the chat.
Fair enough. And I just do want to underline what Lauren said, the grace and the alacrity with which people responded to the invitation to participate in the Festival of Learning. My pride in the orchestral sector is always high. It was juiced by what I heard from people. The honesty, the clarity, the commitment was over the top. And that's a lesson that we'll be carrying with us throughout our program design moving forward. So we're right on one. Jamie, I thank you so much for today's presentation. A small taste of I think, what is a really compelling field of work, and something that as a sector, I look forward to, helping to lead the engagement in moving forward. Thank you to everyone who participated, whether in the webinars or in the consultations, or both. It's been a delight, and of course, our gratitude to the Ontario Trillium Foundation for seeing the value of this work. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to feeling like help moving forward in all the ways. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.